There is nothing quite as dull to discuss, yet absolutely mandatory to understand, as the concept of how sleep impacts capabilities and the ability to conduct operations. It doesn't take a genius to realize that sleep is one of the most important aspects of everything from modern warfare and civil unrest to overall health and general survival. But despite its importance, sleep is one of the very first things that goes right out the window when things get crazy. So to begin, we have to make a slight digression. One of the things that is quite apparent in the tactical prepping military community is that almost all of the doctrine that makes it to the civilian world comes from the US military, and not without good reason. More tax dollars have been spent on defense than literally anything else in American society, so it makes sense to take advantage of everything that we have access to on that front, especially if that doctrine has been tested and those lessons have been learned in actual warfare. However, sometimes we get overzealous and try to implement things from the US military that are not the best. As we have said many times before, we sometimes focus too much on tactical gear when we should perhaps be looking at the entire picture. The classic example that we've mentioned before is the war in Afghanistan. If we Americans were to look at that conflict with objective eyes, we would see the benefit of adopting doctrine from both belligerents in that war. In other words, as distasteful as it seems, I would actually be more inclined to incorporate tactics from the Taliban into my emergency plans, or even daily life if it comes to that, rather than the doctrine established by US forces. And this is for many different reasons. For one, who actually won the Afghan war? It certainly was not the United States. Also, here in the US, we do not have the benefit of learning from our adversaries, at least as much as we do learning from our own peers. Find any gun range, any firearms training course, any tactical company, any gear manufacturer, any podcast, blog, website, or even YouTube channel. I feel pretty comfortable in saying that none of these are being run by former Taliban members. So when it comes to certain things, we must absolutely take into consideration the tactics of our nation's adversaries, particularly if they end up winning the war. And one of those tactics is the concept of sleep. For anyone who has served in the US military, the informal approach across all branches is more or less, you can sleep when you're dead, a concept that is most often applied in combat. Right at the point when you want people to be well rested. Even when not in combat, sleep is certainly not a priority for leadership. For those of you who have served in the military, how many times has the following scenario happened? You have a range day scheduled for 0800, but the sergeant major wants everyone there at 0700 to load the vehicles, and first sergeant wants everyone there at 0600 to get the briefing. Oh, and the armory opens at 0400 for weapons draw, so you've got to be formed up at 0300 to get in line for that. Well, actually 0245 since your platoon sergeant wants to make sure you aren't late. See how insane this is? Sure, it's doable, and millions of service members have done this over the years. Even on combat deployments, it's completely normal to work 12, 16, even 18-hour shifts sometimes, only to crash for a few hours and do it all over again the next day or night without any break for a full year. And people can definitely adapt to this kind of sleep cycle for a year-long deployment. But what about our adversaries? Right now, the US military tries to keep combat deployments to about a year long, just to make sure that people don't get burned out, and so that people have time to decompress. But imagine the Taliban forces, who have been fighting and living inside an 18-year combat deployment in their own country. And that's not even including the Soviet occupation. As a result, and over the course of history, our nation's adversaries have had a very different approach to, well, warfare in general, but specifically rest. As American soldiers found out rather quickly when fighting most insurgencies, an insurgent force almost always has the luxury of deciding the time and place of an actual battle. In this case, the phrase, pick your battles, is actually picking an actual battle. Whereas American ground troops, for the most part, always seem to find themselves on the defensive, even when they were supposed to be on the offensive. Also, insurgent forces were usually forced to adapt to an invading force, and as such, that hardship that they endured made them a very durable and unyielding combat force. What this results in is a lot of interesting doctrine being created and lessons learned, but specifically when it comes to sleep and periods of rest. So let's dive deep and take a look at what this actually might look like. So to cut to the chase, let's use a specific example of a typical insurgent from the later years of the Afghanistan conflict, since that conflict is winding to a close, allegedly. And here's what his day might look like. He would get up quite early. Depending on the season and time of year, this might be as early as 4 a.m. This is for a number of reasons. For one, BMNT, or the beginning of morning nautical twilight, that point in time where the sky just starts to brighten. In Afghanistan, that could be as early as 4 a.m. during the height of the fighting season in the summertime. So our insurgent wakes up and goes about his day, farming, heading down to the local mosque for prayers and to get orders, or going to the market to check on his contacts, preparing food, things like that, ordinary lifestyle stuff. And about midday, during the hottest part of the day, our insurgent sleeps. And again, this is for a few different reasons. For one, it's hot, and in a country where famine is commonplace, it is wasteful to expend calories and sweat during the hottest part of the day. So there is a very practical element to taking a siesta. Also, since our insurgent is, well, an insurgent, it would be a bad idea for him to go about doing his insurgent things like running supplies, checking on weapons, caches, traveling outside, and things that require the security of darkness. So our insurgent takes a long nap during the hottest part of the day. Then in the afternoon, while there is still daylight and it's a bit cooler, chores. Remember, a lot of times, more often than not, insurgent forces throughout history have not been professional full-time guerrilla forces. Sure, in recent years, specifically Taliban forces were directly and openly supported financially by Pakistan and Iran, but by and large, most successful movements, from anything like the Viet Cong in Vietnam and the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia to the Dutch resistance fighters during World War II, the vast majority of these folks were not full-time guerrilla soldiers. So when there was a lull in combat, they had to work to sustain themselves. And when the fighting season was over, they simply went home. And the same is true with our insurgent. But once the evening chores are finished, this is where things get interesting. Despite all of the technologies that allow US soldiers to see in the dark and see the heat of a human that is trying to hide in foliage, the fact of the matter is that human beings naturally feel comfortable in the dark. Every culture throughout the evolution of our species is the same in that regard. If somebody has got something shady to do, they are going to be more inclined to do it at night, even in cases where they know their adversary has the ability to see in the dark. So evening time, just after sunset, is a great time to move supplies or visit colleagues or do anything that might seem a bit odd to be seen doing during the day. Remember, our insurgent is not only hiding from US drones and other surveillance systems, but he also has to hide from his neighbors as well, particularly if his neighbors know that they can get a pretty penny for turning informant, and especially if that neighbor has an incentive for our insurgent to not be around. Also, our insurgent's adversaries, i.e. the United States, are comically predictable when it comes to conducting their own operations. Even early on in the Afghanistan counterinsurgency mission, every single local Afghan knew that the Americans only conduct offensive operations at night. Now, of course, early on in the conflict, when there was an outpost every couple of miles around the country, things were a bit different. But when the insurgency settled into a long drawn-out fight, the US military was discovered to be almost completely incapable of achieving surprise, even special forces. So what this means for our insurgent is that if it's a couple of hours after sunset and there hasn't been a raid in his village and his network hasn't seen or heard Americans' helicopters, he knows he's safe for the night, so he can sleep like he normally would. This is even more true if our insurgent's buddies in the next province over call or radio him that there's a raid over on their side of the district. Our insurgent knows that the chances of a simultaneous raid occurring in his district are very, very slim. So once he finds out that a raid is happening on the other side of the province, he can safely rest easy for the night. But if he does hear helicopters, or if his network of informants detects the movement of US troops in his area, he has a choice. He can either stay and fight, or he can do nothing at all. So in this example, let's say that there's a raid going on in his area and that he's too far away from the action to safely be of help to his Taliban comrades, but let's also say that he needs to safely stay awake and watch what's going on, or help prepare medical supplies or stuff like that. Well, he can do that since he took a nap earlier in the day. You see how this is starting to shake out? Of course, we're not saying that the US military is completely incompetent when it comes to periods of rest. Obviously, all combat services know the extremely important nature of sleep. However, sometimes, actually more often than not, Conventional military forces have to push through fatigue and lack of sleep to accomplish a mission. The key distinction here is that yes, both the insurgent and the soldier most of the time have to function with little sleep, but the decision of when to rest or when to conduct operations lies with the insurgent, not the soldier. No conventional soldier in any military on the planet gets to choose when to go on patrol or move supplies or even wake up and go to work. He or she is always given orders from somebody else. Well, if you are an insurgent who has a much less rigid combat structure and command system, or in some cases no command structure at all, the individual has a lot more flexibility, which is perfect for sustained conflicts of attrition over decades of time. So hopefully this gives everyone some idea of how important sleep is to the average citizen in the United States today. Of course, we are not encouraging anything untoward. We are most certainly not saying that we should turn the U.S. into Afghanistan. That's not good at all. What we are saying is that right now in the United States, things aren't super great, and average citizens are having to use the skills of criminals and people that we traditionally think of as bad guys just to be a little bit more private in a nation where the federal government states that their largest adversary is its citizens. So when this is the case, as it is now, if one is so inclined to try to increase their capabilities and learn new skills, it would be wise to not only look at U.S. military doctrine, but also the doctrine of our nation's most capable and successful adversaries over history, as distasteful as that might seem to some. So open your mind to thinking about things from a different perspective, and make sure that you're seeing the whole picture instead of just the side that promotes Gucci gear and stuff. And on the other hand, this doesn't mean go grab an AK and go pretend to be Timmy Taliban in the mountains for a few days to make yourself feel better. What it means is to learn. Like we constantly reiterate, the boring stuff is what wins conflicts. So don't forget to get some sleep, and more importantly, be ready to adapt your sleeping habits to adjust to long-term changes. And with that, we will see you all next time. And always remember, fight in the shade.